They said she was the most photographed woman on earth, the blonde who turned light itself into a lover, the smile America taught itself to imitate. Flashbulbs bloomed wherever she stood, and yet there were nights, even at the absolute height of her glory, when she felt like an actress trapped on a stage that never went dark. She could conquer a room with the tilt of her head, hush a crowd with a breath between syllables, float down a staircase as if the air had decided to hold her. But fame is a mirror that returns everything except warmth, and the higher she climbed, the colder the air became. In hotel suites wrapped in satin and silence, she learned the ritual of being adored from a distance. The door that never stayed closed, the phone that never stopped ringing, the knock that always arrived just when she had almost fallen asleep. Studio men speaking in schedules and numbers, photographers speaking in flattery and light, strangers speaking in myths as if they knew her better than she did. She smiled. She signed. She performed. And at 2 in the morning, when makeup lay folded on a towel and the last pair of shoes had been kicked into a corner, she would stare at herself in the bathroom mirror and try to find the girl inside the glow. Sometimes she did. Sometimes she couldn't. America loved her as an idea. It loved that idea so loudly she could not hear her own. The nation was building a new decade, sleek chrome, polished optimism, a future with edges smoothed by television, and she became its soft focus. But behind the softness there was hunger, for a voice that did not shake, for a hand that did not leave first, for a room where she could breathe without being watched. She wanted to be taken seriously when she spoke in her lower register about work, about craft, about the shape of a scene. She wanted men to look at her and hear a mind move. And when that did not happen, when the gaze kept sliding from her eyes to a version of her the world had invented, she learned the dangerous comfort of quiet. Power is a different kind of quiet. It doesn't need to announce itself, because rooms are built to lean toward it. On certain evenings, after premieres where the applause hit her like warm rain, she would glide into gatherings where laughter rose like champagne and every conversation braided politics and charm. Washington men in tailored restraint, Hollywood men in glossy bravado, reporters with sharpened smiles, wives who knew the choreography of a glance and the cost of pretending not to notice. Somewhere in that civilized weather there were eyes that met hers with something steadier than appetite. He was not the first important man she had met, nor even the first to address her as if her soul were seated right beside her beauty, but he carried a gravity that rearranged the air without effort. He listened the way only people trained to win elections listen, attentive, generous, sure of the effect. And yet there was an undercurrent, a human curiosity that felt less like calculation and more like recognition. She did not fall in love with a title. Titles had always treated her like an ornament. She responded to cadence, to a humor that ran dry and quick, to the way he seemed to consider each answer before giving it. As if truth and strategy were a pair of coins he flipped so deftly you could not see which side landed. His laugh was warmer than rumors. His charm was a jacket he could slip on or off depending on the weather of a room. And when his attention settled on her, it did the one thing attention rarely did. It did not take. It included. For an hour that slid by like a secret, she felt less like a picture and more like a person. Later, alone beneath a hotel lamp, she tried to file the evening the way she filed lines before a scene. What did he want? What did she? The questions didn't frighten her. What frightened her was how easily the room had disappeared when he began speaking softly about books he pretended to have more time to read than he did, about a childhood shaped by expectation, about oceans that looked different from the deck of a warship than from the shore. There were things the nation believed about him and things the nation would never be allowed to see. She recognized the distance between those two maps. She lived inside a similar one. The next encounter arrived like all important scenes do, composed of minor gestures that later feel preordained. A corridor with carpet thick enough to swallow footsteps. A door that opened just wide enough to let discretion through. A conversation that began safely, work, scheduling, the careful dance of public life, and drifted into a quiet where neither of them had to perform. There are rooms where history is written with signatures, and there are rooms where it is written with pauses. In one such pause, he asked a question simple as a glass of water. "Are you happy?" She told the truth the way people do when they've grown, tired of pleasing their own myth. Sometimes, when "I'm allowed to be," he nodded as if she had given the correct answer to a question no one else had properly heard. Powerful men love the honesty they rarely receive. Famous women love the attention that does not ask for payment in return. Between them, a country existed. The cameras, the crowds, the schedule built like a fortress. But for the space of a conversation, it was possible to imagine a different geography. Not a romance with violins and headlines, but a tenderness with edges, the kind you can only keep in the dark. She understood the risk in outline, if not in detail. He wasn't only a man, he was an office. And an office is never alone. It walks with security and history and expectation. It answers to a nation before it answers to a heart. It belongs to power the way she belonged to light. He knew the arithmetic as well. In politics, the smallest rumor can grow teeth, and the gentlest truth can ruin more brutally than a lie. They did not speak the word danger. They didn't need to. It sat between them like a third presence, and still a feeling rose, part magnet, part mercy, that complicated caution. Public life trains you to live in compartments. He had mastered it to survive. She had learned it to be believed. Over time, compartments become corridors. Corridors become habits. Habits become the way two people find a space for tenderness without betraying the structures that feed them. Phone calls at careful hours. Messages relayed through the kind of diplomacy only trusted friends can manage. Appearances engineered so coincidence could do the work choreography was not allowed to do. No plans, only windows. No promises. Only a temperature that rose when they occupied the same air. Power, like fame, devours certainty. It promises control and delivers vulnerability. The closer she drew to the heat of his office, the speeches, the motorcades, the rooms where every chair had a memory, the more she felt the old ache sharpen. To be seen, to be chosen, to be handled gently. Men had told her she was unforgettable. Very few had treated her as if she were irreplaceable. He did not make that mistake. Perhaps could not. The nation came first. The nation always would. But within those limits he listened, and in the narrow geometry of their encounters, that listening felt radical. She had spent years learning how to be Marilyn Monroe for the world and still keep a fragile center for herself. With him, the roles reversed. He wore the nation's face, and for brief intervals he let it slip. In those moments, she saw the fatigue beneath the posture, the ordinary hunger underneath the extraordinary life. He asked her what it felt like to carry a persona like a cloak. "Heavy," she said, "when people forget you're under it." He smiled the rueful smile of a man who knew the shape of that weight. Their nearness was never a public thing. It existed in the undertow. A glance extended half a second longer than cameras could capture. A private hello rehearsed as a casual greeting. Names that could not be said aloud, spoken with the safety of a shared understanding. We are not what they think we are, and we cannot be what we might wish to be. It was not an affair in the operatic sense. Not a soap opera soaking the floorboards of the Capitol. It was rarer, and thus more dangerous. It was intimacy. She told herself that boundaries were kindness. He belonged to a country, she to a fantasy. Neither could offer the other the harbor a quieter life allows. She did not demand futures. He did not offer them. And yet the heart, undisciplined as weather, will make its own plan. It drifts forward. It imagines meetings that last 5 minutes longer. It writes the line you hope to hear and hides it inside a joke. It bargains with reality, just this once, just one more time, just until the season changes. On a spring evening that looked like a photograph, even as it was happening, she stood by a window and watched the city burn its yellow constellations across the night. Down there, cars braided into rivers, couples argued and reconciled beneath awnings, a waiter refilled a glass, a child pressed his face to a screen door and felt the cool of it on his cheek. Ordinary life moved, messy, anonymous, blessed. She swore she could step out of the dress, undo the last line of makeup, and walk right into it. But elevators in those hotels do not carry you down to ordinary. They carry you laterally from one private floor to another. What drew her was not the parade of power. She had walked in enough rooms to be immune to ceremony. What drew her was that he, like her, understood how devotion could be noisy, and love, when it was real, had to be quiet. The country's love for him was engineered, measured, set to a schedule. The world's love for her was a machine that could not be turned off. When two machines meet, they grind. When two people meet inside that sound and still manage to hear each other, it is almost a miracle. There are moments preserved in rumor and others preserved in memory. The world keeps the rumor. The people involved keep the memory. She kept the way his voice softened when the door closed. He kept the way her eyes steadied when she stopped being the woman on the poster and became the woman on the couch, bare feet tucked beneath her, asking questions that had nothing to do with headlines and everything to do with ordinary tenderness. Are you sleeping? Do you eat anything when they won't leave you alone? When was the last time you felt like yourself? He answered honestly when he could. Politicians ration honesty as a survival skill. She rationed belief for the same reason. Somewhere beneath those exchanges lay a truth neither of them needed to say. This cannot last. It is a season, not a state. It will be measured later, not in years, not even in months, but in the way a soft thing altered two lives that had been hardened by attention. The first time she saw him in a room filled with flags and portraits, she felt both braver and smaller. Braver because she had decided to own the space she occupied. Smaller because history has a way of resizing you without asking permission. He moved through that room like a man crossing a river he had learned as a boy, confident in every stone. She entered like weather, changing the temperature by merely existing, eyes turned without anyone meaning to. He greeted her as if she'd just come in from the rain and he had saved a dry towel for her. For a moment, the choreography of the Republic faltered, then recovered, disciplined as ever. In the days that followed, she worked. She learned lines. She argued for scenes to be truer, for women on screen to think before they kissed, to leave before they begged. She called her coach late at night and spoke in circles about craft because craft was the only thing that made her feel safe in a world built to use her. But somewhere inside the work, a second rhythm developed, one that kept time with meetings that might happen and might not, with the possibility that a door would open and the world would briefly recede. It is easy to call such a connection foolish. It is harder to live without one when your life belongs to public appetite. She had tried the safe versions of love and found them too empty to fill the rooms of her loneliness. She had tried the dangerous versions and found them too loud to quiet her fears. This was neither. It was something narrower, a thread strung between two cliff edges. You do not walk it because you enjoy falling. You walk it because the view from the center is the only one that feels like yours. He never promised rescue. She never asked for it. Rescue is a fairy tale, and they were both too educated by reality to mistake narrative for life. What he offered was attention at a frequency she had forgotten existed. What she offered was the mercy of being looked at without being consumed. In another century, they might have been letters folded into books. In that moment, they were time stolen respectfully from obligations that never slept. When the world brought them to the same city for that now famous night in May, she understood what the moment would cost even as she felt what it could give. A stage is a dangerous place for a secret to breathe, but she had always told the truth through performance better than she could in conversation. She put on the dress that fit like rumor and light, practiced the line that would cross a continent in 20 syllables, and decided to carry the risk as if it were silk. The song was a whisper melted into a smile. It curled through the air and found his face where he sat under the reigning calm of a man who knows every camera angle by instinct. In the distance between her voice and his expression, history would later build a mansion of speculation. Inside the moment itself, there was only a simple exchange, an acknowledgement that they were both alive in the same room, both hungry in ways a nation could never feed, both limited by obligations larger than any private ache. When the applause broke like surf, she felt, for a flash, what it might mean to be free of both machines at once. Then the curtain fell, the nation kept breathing, the motorcades turned back into iron rivers, and she returned to a suite where the mirror waited, honest as ever. She washed the performance from her face and stood very still, as if stillness could slow history. In the hours after, he returned to the geometry of power, where every line intersects with consequence. Calls were made. Schedules were arranged with the care of a jeweler. The Republic resumed its rituals, and somewhere beneath those rituals, a tenderness continued. Not demanding, not theatrical, only present. She knew there are thresholds you cross that you cannot uncross. She had crossed one. Not into scandal, into clarity. The clarity that what she wanted and what the world would allow could be mapped finally, not with questions but with borders. Love for them would be a city visited at night, never lived in. You can learn to survive that, she told herself. You can teach your heart to keep a suitcase packed. The danger was never the kiss. It was the quiet after when the heart begins to narrate futures. It has no authority to authorize. She spoke to it the way you speak to a child who doesn't yet understand the rules of the house, gently, repeatedly, with a kindness that costs. And the heart, like a child, listened just enough to keep from breaking things, then tried the door again the next night. Outside, the decade accelerated, marches, missiles, the music of a nation learning new chords. Inside, she moved between sets and private rooms, learning to carry poise like a fragile glass filled to the rim. He moved between the world's crises and his own reflection, learning to accept that the office had its own appetite, insatiable and precise. When at rare intervals their paths crossed, the world registered only the slight change in weather, like a barometer twitching, and went on with its storms. What they built was not a romance for public consumption. It was a shelter for two overexposed souls who recognized in each other the loneliness that power cannot cure and fame cannot anesthetize. It could not last. They knew that. But while it did, it was real in the way that matters most to people who live surrounded by performance. It was unperformed. And for a little while, in a country that wanted idols more than people, they allowed each other to be people. Under the glittering surface of America's Camelot, the truth began to narrow like a hallway with fewer doors. There is always a moment, quiet, almost forgettable, when a possibility begins to die, not with drama, but with the heaviness of inevitability. For her, it arrived in pieces, a missed call that was never returned, a message relayed through someone who used to be warmer, a change in tone from a voice once soft in the dark. Power seldom says goodbye. It simply shifts its weight and expects the world to adjust. She sensed it before she admitted it. Fame had sharpened her instincts to a knife edge. She could read devotion the way actors read camera angles. She felt the subtle tightening around him, advisors who preferred clean lines and predictable narratives, aides trained to extinguish heat before it could reach the press. The unspoken rule that fragility, even whispered, had no place near the Oval Office. Political life demands discipline even in desire. She knew this. Still, knowledge does not dull longing. It only teaches it to speak more quietly. Her career glittered, her laughter filled sound stages, but the world behind her eyes grew dimmer. She had always battled loneliness. Now it came with structure, wearing the mask of discretion. The more he became a symbol, the more she became one too. Symbols cannot comfort each other. They can only acknowledge their shape and then return to their pedestals. For him, duty was not a word. It was the air he breathed. Every decision he made carried the weight of a country trembling between hope and fear. The Cold War chilled the world's spine. Battles in faraway places turned into headlines that peeled across breakfast tables. His days were measured in crises and compromises. His nights were claimed by history before they even arrived. And where could a woman like her fit in that machinery? Not beside him. Only adjacent and only in shadow. He cared. That was never the question. But caring is not the language politics speaks fluently. Politics speaks in leverage, outcomes, managed risks. And love, especially fragile love, is a risk without a strategy. She saw the distance growing, subtle as breath on glass. It wasn't cruelty. It was gravity. The kind that pulls powerful men toward caution and pulls vulnerable hearts toward quiet grief. In another world, they might have sat in a sunlit kitchen eating toast and laughing about nothing. In this one, they occupied parallel thrones, one gilded by Hollywood flash, the other fortified by white marble and steel. Two crowns, neither capable of sheltering the other. Her voice, once buoyant, began to soften around its edges, not in her work, but in those private hours when she was no longer Marilyn Monroe, just a woman looking for warmth. She turned pages in books she once read to feel educated, but now read to feel less alone. She practiced lines not to impress directors, but to remind herself she could inhabit someone else's life, if only for a moment. Some nights, she sat with the piano and struck slow notes, as if she were speaking to herself in a language no one else could hear. Meanwhile, the world pressed closer, curious and hungry. Gossip never sleeps, and the scent of proximity to power travels faster than truth. She could feel eyes at the edges of her life, trying to peer in. A senator's wife who watched too closely at a gala. A journalist whose smile was polite but predatory. A studio head who cautioned her, gently but firmly, that America adored a fantasy and would punish her for wanting reality. He felt it too. And in the machinery of governance, threat is handled with silence. What was tender between them became a secret. What was once a secret became a liability. What was a liability became a danger neither could name without changing everything. Love has stages: discovery, surrender, tension, and, if the world is unkind, loss. They were entering the stage where gestures shrink, where sentences shorten, where pauses lengthen until they become the whole conversation. Still, there were moments, brief, incandescent, when the old warmth slid back into place. A whisper in a crowded room. A hand on a forearm longer than propriety allowed. A small smile exchanged like contraband. These scraps carried them through even as the world outside tightened its grip. She tried to be brave, tried to imagine a life where the memory of him was enough, tried to convince herself that the stage lights were a sun she could live under forever. But fame cannot warm you when love has already done the job and left its imprint on the bone. And in the White House, surrounded by portraits of leaders who had made sacrifices of flesh and feeling, he understood that history required obedience not to passion, but to narrative. America needed a perfect family. Perfect wives, perfect illusions. Presidents do not get private hearts. They borrow them briefly, then return them to the dark. One evening, after a gala where their distance had been choreographed so gracefully the world applauded their separation without knowing it, she sat alone in a hotel room, lights off, curtains drawn, the city humming beneath her like a distant pulse. She whispered to the quiet, "If love must hide, does it still count as love?" There was no answer. Just the hum. Just her heartbeat. Just the faint ghost of his voice in her memory, saying her name with a softness that now felt like a dream someone else had dreamed. The world would soon turn sharper. Voices would grow harsher. She would face rooms colder than any spotlight, and rooms darker than any camera lens. But in that moment, fragile, poised on the brink of the storm, she still held a truth only she and he would ever fully understand. Sometimes the greatest power in the world belongs not to a president or to a star, but to the love neither of them is allowed to keep. The world did not crash at once. It tightened quietly, the way a noose tightens when no one is looking. It began with whispers disguised as concern, studio executives with fatherly tones, political aides with diplomatic phrasing, friends who spoke cautiously as if the air itself might be recording. People who had never cared about her happiness suddenly cared deeply about her reputation. She recognized the pattern. When a woman begins to matter in ways men cannot control, the world rushes to protect her from herself, never from them. At luncheons and premieres, she heard her name bend in the mouths of strangers. She's fragile. She's impulsive. She needs guidance. Words sharpened, not to wound her, but to contain her. They always say fragility when they mean threat. And she was a threat, not to the state, but to the story the state required. Because if the public ever believed she had touched the inner chamber of power, even briefly, then she was no longer fantasy. She was influence. And influence, when it wears lipstick and silk and refuses to apologize for wanting to be loved, terrifies men who build their kingdoms on control. So they softened her in the press. Then they hardened her. Then they blurred her. A woman cannot be dangerous if she is dismissed as delicate. She cannot be real if she is painted as unreal. And she cannot be mourned if she was never fully believed. Meanwhile, he stood behind lecterns and shook hands and signed bills, and the nation adored him for his poise, his brilliance, his promise. Cameras found his good angles. Reporters traced his smile as if it held prophecy. The world called him leader, icon, destiny. They did not see the exhaustion in his posture when he believed no one was watching, the way decision after decision carved him hollow. They did not see that even victory felt like obligation. There are loves that bloom in sunlight, and there are loves that survive only because they never step into it. They remained the second kind. Yet, no matter how careful the corridors, the walls had ears. Rumor slithered through Washington cocktail rooms like perfume. Photographers grew greedy. Editors sharpened their teeth. What once existed in whispers began to echo, and in politics, echoes turn into storms. Control is not merely held, it must be seen to be held. And so proximity became danger, and danger required distance. He did not say it plainly. Powerful men rarely do. But she felt the shift. Calls spaced wider. Meetings postponed until postponed meant never. A message delivered through a third party instead of a familiar voice. She did not beg. That was never her shape. But she ached. That she could not help. The fault was not in him alone. She had always asked the world for more than it wanted to give women like her: respect, tenderness, truth. She asked to be seen not just as a dream, but as a person. And the world, terrified of losing its fantasies, punished her for her clarity. There were nights she sat with a dim lamp and a glass she rarely finished, tracing with a fingertip the outline of a photograph that never made it to print. Her laughing, mid-sentence, unaware of the camera, alive in a way the world never allowed her to be. Youth and hope in a single breath. A moment caught before the world grew heavy. He was not in the picture, but he was in the glow. Her friends, those few who loved her without agenda, saw the shift in her. The quiet, the inwardness, the way she held her laughter like a fragile object instead of throwing it loosely into the room. She still smiled on cue. Performers do not forget their reflexes. But her eyes began to soften, not from weakness, but from the weariness of holding emotion without a place to set it down. He noticed it too. Their final meetings held a tenderness sharpened by time's impatience. They spoke in gentle half-sentences, each trying not to bruise the other with the truth. Neither said aloud, "The story is ending." History has claimed him. Isolation has claimed her. And yet, in those last moments when the world could not reach them, there was still the small miracle of understanding. He looked at her not as an ornament or a symbol, but as someone whose loneliness mirrored his own. She touched his hand not as a plea, but as a goodbye without finality, a promise that the softness they found would exist somewhere, even if only in memory. They did not break apart dramatically. They drifted, like two ships who once sailed close enough to exchange lantern light, then turned toward different horizons, not out of disloyalty, but out of duty. In the press, she became a story again. In the White House, he became a legend still being written. And in the quiet room where she slept alone, fame curled around her like a beautiful, suffocating blanket. She had loved a man who belonged to a nation. He had cared for a woman who belonged to the world's imagination. Neither had been allowed to belong to themselves. History would later pretend to know them. Rumor would pretend to own them, but the truth remained simple, human, and quietly devastating. Two people met in the impossible space between power and vulnerability, and loved each other in the only way fate allowed. Softly, secretly, and never enough. And from that silence would rise the rest of her story. The unraveling, the longing, the search for comfort in places that could not offer it, the spiral that begins when the heart has once known truth and must return to a world made of illusions. It was not the affair that changed her. It was the loss of gravity afterward, and she would spend the rest of her days learning how to live without the one person who had ever seen the woman behind the myth and chosen to speak to her gently. There are heartbreaks the world witnesses, and there are heartbreaks that happen behind silk curtains, where no audience applauds, no camera flashes, and no diary survives to quote. Hers was the second kind, a quiet collapse, elegant on the outside, shattering inwardly. The type reserved for women the world believes are too adored to suffer, too luminous to dim, too adored to be abandoned even by fate. She learned quickly that ending was not truly an ending. It was a long unravel. You don't lose someone like that all at once. You lose them in echoes, in flashes, in phantom phone calls your heart still expects. You lose them in the muscle memory of hope. One morning she woke up and realized she had checked the phone 3 times before standing up, knowing rationally there would be nothing. Wanting irrationally a message only 2 hearts understood, and something inside her lowered like an evening curtain, a surrender without theater. She returned to sets, to scripts, to the hum of studio gossip that mistook her silence for fragility rather than dignity. Sound stages swallowed her entire days again. Armies of lights overhead, costumes heavy with glamour, lenses capturing desire the way microscopes capture slides. Men called her beautiful. Women called her tragic. America called her myth. But inside she felt like an attic room, dust floating in stillness, the air untouched, the door locked not from outside but from within. When a love cannot be named, neither can the wound it leaves. She tried to heal the way she had always been taught to. With work. With perfection. With control. And when work did not soothe her, she tried to heal with escape. Not scandal, escape. Escape from the noise, from questions, from her own reflection. But Hollywood does not permit stillness. It swarms silence like bees over nectar. Reporters asked about her next romance as if hearts replenish like costumes on a rack. Studio heads looked at her as though heartbreak were a liability in a woman whose very image sold happiness. Lovers approached her not for comfort, but conquest, eager to say they were brave enough to court the world's most desired woman. Blind to the fact desire was not what she needed, she began to search for calm in pills prescribed too easily, in sips of champagne handed to her with sympathy wrapped as glamour. Doctors tried to balance her. Studios tried to harness her. The public tried to worship her. But devotion is not shelter when a heart is tired. Sometimes she tried to explain it, gently, tentatively, that love is not lost like an object. It is lost like oxygen, slowly, imperceptibly, and when you finally realize it's gone, your chest has already begun to collapse, and across the country, in rooms lined with flags and portraits of giants, he carried on, signing directives, shaking hands, making promises shaped for nations, not for hearts. But late at night, when the corridors were empty and the weight of global expectation pressed harder than his tailored jacket ever could, he sometimes let his thoughts drift toward a woman whose laugh once softened him. Not out loud. Never aloud. You do not speak softness into rooms built for power. He admired her, perhaps more than he intended. And admiration is dangerous in a man who leads a nation. Tenderness guilted him. Not for caring, that was human, but for knowing he could not afford to. History does not write sympathy into the margins for men who rule, nor mercy for women who love them. The distance between them grew into silence, and silence, when stretched over longing, becomes grief. But grief in her life did not announce itself with tears. It seeped through smiles, sank into the way her voice sometimes trembled on the last note of a song, hid in the way she hesitated before stepping into light. She tried to reinvent herself, took classes, read books on philosophy and acting theory, dreamed of roles that would let her speak not as a decoration, but as a mind. But women who glow are rarely permitted to rise. The world always tries to drag them back to the shine it demands. He moved through history like a comet, brilliant, brief, destined for tragedy she could not yet imagine. She moved through fame like a candle, flickering, resilient, doomed by the very heat she created. They had been 2 souls meeting in a corridor neither could stay in, and the corridor had closed. What remained was a feeling that did not know where to live, so it lived everywhere. In whispers, in rumors, In photographs where her eyes looked just a little too tired, in speeches where his voice paused for half a breath longer than protocol liked. It lived in the world as myth, and in them as ache. Slowly she began to search not for him, she would never be reckless enough to try, but for the version of herself who had existed before him. That girl felt distant now, blurred by stardust and longing. She asked herself quietly, almost prayerfully, who was I before I loved what I could not keep? Some nights she heard no answer. Some nights she heard only the echo of what might have been, and then came the shadow of the years that followed, the men who promised comfort and delivered only their own hunger, the headlines that dissected her as if beauty made her less human, the chronic ache of being adored by millions but held by no one. Because once you have loved someone real inside a world of illusions, illusions can no longer feed you, and she was hungry, not for fame, not for applause, but for peace. The one thing she never found on set or on stage, or in the crowd that worshipped her silhouette instead of holding her hand. What she did not know, what neither of them knew, was that history was already bending toward tragedy for them both. Parallel falls echoing through time, each shadowed by power, each softened by memory. Two lives running toward fate. Two hearts that touched and retreated. Two tragedies waiting for their final act. And somewhere between those truths, she whispered once more into the quiet, not expecting an answer, but needing to release the weight. I hope you were happy, because she understood something most stories never teach. Love does not always end in bitterness. Sometimes it ends in blessing, even if the blessing hurts.